Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name's Michael Cade. I'm joined by Bharat. We're going to talk today about understanding audit logging and what it means for you and how you can protect your most important assets, which is your data on the Qumulo cluster. So without further ado, we'll get started. The agenda for today is just basically understanding auditing, how you enable auditing on the Qumulo cluster, what's some of the audit processing software that exists out in the industry today, a little process that we created called Log Filter, and I'll explain what it means and how it benefits you, doing a little demonstration on ElasticSearch, and also talking about Splunk and auditing and doing a demonstration about Splunk. We'll wrap it up with some Q&A. So let's understand a little bit about what auditing is. So a Qumulo cluster has the capability to track all changes to any cluster configuration at all, whether that's logging in, changing a share, changing or creating an export, creating a share, changing it, etc. Also, all file system objects. So whenever you open a file, close a file, rename a file, read a file, write a file, you get the idea. All of that is audited. Now, in order to not impact the performance, the Qumulo cluster will not store or process those audit logs. Your Qumulo is meant for one thing, and that is to to store and to process data as fast as possible. And that does not include processing audit logs, which takes a lot of CPU. So what Qumulo does is that we pass all those audit events off to a syslog server. And typically that's a Linux server running our syslog. We'll explain in a little bit how that looks. Also, all audit events are deduped before being sent to the syslog server. This is to eliminate things like, I read from a file 5,000 times in 5 seconds. Well, there's no reason to put 5,000 events in the syslog server for reading the same file. Basically, within that short a time frame, we'd send 1 or 2 events. We wouldn't send all 5,000. So in order to start auditing, you need 2 things. First is you need to turn on auditing on the Qumulo cluster. And there's if you look at the UI, there's a tab called cluster at the top, and about a third of the way down, you'll see a tab called audit. And you go into that tab, and then you would name either through a full path name for DNS lookup or an IP address, what the syslog server is. That configuration then is stored in the Qumulo, and it attempts to connect to the syslog server almost immediately. So probably what you want to do is you actually want to set up a syslog server. We actually have an article out on the CARE site that tells you exactly what to do there. It's a very, very simple process. It's only a 1-pager, shows you exactly what to do in order to turn on a syslog server and have it start to gather all those logs. Now, a syslog server does not process it, only gathers logs and puts them into a directory and then prune those logs after a certain period of time. But it will not do any processing. You need additional software for that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So this is some of the fields that you're going to see if you were to look at one of the logs in a syslog server. You'd see the IP address of the user who caused the event to occur, the user name that performed the action. Now in NFS, we can't do a lookup on the name. So it'd be a UID number, but in SMB, we'd actually have the name and we'd look that up. The protocol that it came through, whether it was the API, whether it was an admin event, whether it was SMB 2 or 3, whether it was NFS 3 or 4, et cetera, and that's all identified. The operation that occurred. So for instance, I'm doing a file system operation, and maybe what I want to do is I'm reading data. Well, we preface that by the word, if you will, or the phrase FS underbar. So you'd see FS underbar read underbar data. all of those things would be with FS underbar, and you'll see that. I think we have that in another slide. Whether it's a management operation, in other words, I logged into the cluster, I changed something on the cluster, et cetera, all that's logged. And then the status, did it succeed or did it fail? The file ID of the file that it was operated on, and then two pieces of data I think are really critical. The file path the operation was performed on, and the secondary file path. So the secondary is used only when you do renames or moves of the data. Otherwise, it would be in the file path. So this is basically what it looks like. We have two formats. One is new for 6.0.0, which just came out. So you'll see the CSV right there with the IP address as we explained, the username, the protocol, the operation there. You'd see FS read data, whether the operation is okay. The file ID is 1, 2, 3, and then the path, and then there's a blank at the end because we didn't rename it, we just read the data. The same thing would occur, but it's in JSON format, and you'd have to actually go to the cluster and enable JSON format if you want. Most syslog servers process in CSV, but there is software that exists that actually processes it in JSON, and that's why we created that. So what is some of the audit log software that exists? So you may have heard of some of these things: Sumo Logic, Datadog, Manage Engine, CrowdStrike, SolarWinds, Nagios. I could go on and on. There's a myriad of software that goes out and processes syslogs. You would need a syslog server for almost every single one of these. Some of them will accept the syslog format direct, but most of them take it from a syslog server and import once the syslog server has actually got the data and processed it and put it into a directory format. Probably two of the most well-known pieces of software, Splunk and ElasticSearch, and we're going to talk about and demonstrate both of those today. So what is Log Filter? It's a little piece of software that we actually created in Qumulo. It is not middleware. It does not get in the middle of your syslog from the cluster to the syslog server. Rather, what it is it's a simple tool where you answer a bunch of questions and it goes and configures the syslog server for you for a specific type of event. So in other words, in general, configuring a syslog server is extremely simple. And as I said, we have a care article that shows that in a one-page format. But there are times when it can become a bit more complicated. And I'll give you an example. Qumulo always passes the data on TCP port 514. You can, of course, change the port if you wish, but it can't change the protocol. It's always TCP. Well, believe it or not, there is some software out there that requires UDP. So the Qumulo would actually send the data via TCP. The syslog server, after it's been reconfigured with the log filter, can break that and redirect it to UDP. So not only can process it and store it, but it can forward it, if you will. So like a store and forward. But in the forward case, it would forward it via UDP on some port. Again, we say 514, but that could be something else. The other thing it can do is that the syslog server, since it's very lightweight and handles things very quickly, what the log filter will do is it will create a syslog config that will split the logs based upon the type of data that comes in. So for instance, maybe all you want is file creates and file deletes because you want to track potential ransomware violations. So you want to know when files are created and when they're deleted, but you don't need to know about all the reads and writes and admin things. So you split that and maybe you'll put that in one type of log. And then in another one, maybe you want to track only the people who go and change the configuration of the cluster. That could be another split. And so you can have these multiple splits so that you can look at the logs in much smaller chunks. And there are pieces of software in the industry that like this, where they will actually filter it and then look at just smaller pieces so that they're not getting the big, huge, voluminous logs of everything that occurs on the cluster. So I'm going to demonstrate ElasticSearch right now just to show you what exists, but let me just tell you a little bit about what I've done. I've got ElasticSearch running in Qumulo Corporate on a 4-node Docker cluster, or a Docker swarm, actually, I guess you could call it. I've got 2 Qumulo clusters that are passing data off to the same syslog server. A syslog server can process many, many, many clusters. There's, like I said, it's very lightweight, so it can handle it. In addition to taking the log filter and doing the splits, it can do all of that. So don't worry about the syslog server. But in my demonstration, I have a cluster with 500 video surveillance cameras in our corporate offices, and I'm passing the logs from that cluster onto a syslog server and then importing those into ElasticSearch. And another one, I've got just a generic cluster with almost no load on it. Now, I'm going to use that cluster to actually demonstrate some NFS traffic to show you the logs being built up in addition to what's happening on the video surveillance cluster. Now, this software that I've done and that I built for a Docker cluster or Docker swarm is actually available on our GitHub site as a demonstration. So, you know, you should take it exactly as a demonstration. If you were to download it and execute it, I mean, create the swarm and build it up, it would run, and it would run perfectly. And it's got a little video right there that I spend about 40-50 minutes showing you step by step what to do when you go to GitHub and you download it and you want to install it. So without further ado, let me just get out of this. Let me go to my 2 clusters. So you should be able to see Groot right here. This is a cluster with almost no load. As you can see, it's really got no load on it at all. And then I've got this one running video surveillance, a 6-node cluster, and it's running about anywhere from 150 to 275 megabytes per second consistently all the time with 500 cameras. Now, that ElasticSearch is already running. I'm actually going to go into it. I've just got to move the Zoom thing out of the way because it always gets on top of the UNC path there. And I can go to any node of that Docker cluster. So I have it running on clients called AC1-100 gig through AC4-100 gig in my lab. I actually have built in to that GitHub with the Docker Compose file, I've actually built in a proxy that listens on all 4 of those and redirects it to this Kibana instance, which is your console, if you will, for displaying data. So you don't need to know where in the Docker cluster or in the Docker swarm Kibana is running or Elasticsearch is running, because the proxies will go and grab from any one of the 4 nodes of the Docker swarm and redirect it to where the Kibana is. So let's just start. This is the home page. It's kind of meaningless, you know, if you're building a Docker cluster and you want to look at ElasticSearch and the data in it. This is something you might be interested in. But in general, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start right here and say, let's look at the data as it comes in. So you'll see right now within the last 15 minutes, and I know 15 minutes because you'll see where my cursor is running. It says last 15 minutes. I've gotten 168,000 entries, and this is the raw data. You don't really need to look at this in general from day to day. Really, what you're going to be interested in is looking at a dashboard. So I have, in my prototype, built the dashboard and individual visualization panels. So what you do is you build a panel first, you create a dashboard, and you drag and drop those panels onto a dashboard. And I'll show you those panels in a moment, but let's just see it as a full dashboard to start with. So I have here just some, you know, metadata that I wrote in a blank panel. I look at the number of clusters that are reporting and I put that out there. I look at the count of the records. I have a control panel where I can select the things that I want to look at and filter based upon that. I have the number of entries per node. Now, you should note that the way that audit logging works in a Qumulo is, let's say that I have two clusters, one with 12 nodes and one with 6. The way the data is reported to the syslog server is, even though you sign up with the syslog server from any node for the entire cluster, so I can go to node 1 on a cluster, sign up for the syslog server, and then I don't have to worry about the other nodes. The cluster knows what to do. In actual fact, every single node reports their syslog entries, or their event entries, or their audit entries, whatever terminology you want to use, into the syslog server. So you'll see it's broken down. And I actually kind of like that, because then I can break down the load per node and I can see what's happening. Because I've got video surveillance running, and it's running almost all the time, you'll see the majority of my records are from alliances, QC 104, the name of that cluster, and I've got one node called group 12 from some data I had in there. You see the protocol operations, 99.99% are SMB2 at the moment. I'm going to change that in a minute by doing some activity on Groot with some NFS clients. I can see the file system operations, like here's my open, and I get a count when I rest my cursor on there, and I can actually see exactly what the percentage is and how many records I received from each one of those. I break it down by file extension. So I actually, part of the data is, of course, the file path. I processed in syslog. This is one of the things you can do, where I took the extension off that file path and created a brand new entry in the syslog audit so that I could get the file path extension. You could see .blk, .idx, and these all pertain mainly to, again, video surveillance, but you'll see it in a moment when I change it to NFS. The accesses by user, and this is over a 30-second period. It looks every 30 seconds, and then you can see the alliances milestone service, because I get a username, and then I've got some other usernames in here that came in. These are machine accounts. And then whether or not those operations work, the majority of them are okay. Sometimes I get an access denied or an entry, and then file deletes. So these are all the deletes by the login ID, how many, and the exact path. So now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come to this little bar, and I'm going to change my time and say, I want to report in the last 30 minutes. But the other thing I want to do is I want to refresh the screen every 5 seconds. I don't know if you've noticed, the screen is not refreshed at all. I have to actually start that, and now every 5 seconds, it's going to update the screen with the records, and there you see the count just changed. Now, let me select the cluster. Let's say I only want to look at the alliances 104, and now I see that, and I only have one cluster. I have operations for that video surveillance cluster, et cetera. If I were to clear this, apply the changes, come here and say, I want to select the other one and apply the changes, you'll see I've got no activity from that cluster, right? 2 records in the last 30 minutes. Now, let me go to, and I'm just going to do this, and then I'll come back to the screen. I've got AC1 100 gig, AC2 100 gig, AC3 100 gig, all with NFS mounts going to Groot. And what I'm going to do is just run this find, which, by the way, a find in this case, since we're not doing anything with the data, it's just going to do metadata operations. In other words, it's going to walk through all the data, but it's not opening the file and reading it, but it's reporting it as metadata operations. So I'm going to go through. And the reason I'm doing it from 3 is I want to show you that what we're going to get is a bunch of file system operations. Look at that, 5,900, and it's coming from basically 3 nodes. There it is, the top 3 that are reporting, Groot 7, 3, and 1, because these 3 clients are going to 3 different nodes. It's coming in as NFS v4 because that's how I mounted it. And now you can see most of it is read metadata, and I've got a bunch of list directories. So, you know, the way find works is it lists the directory and then it looks at the metadata for each of the files. And then down here, you'll see the file types that we crossed as we're going over them. I'm not going to see basically accesses by user yet. I just don't have enough data. Everything was okay, and I've got no deletes. So now let me go through and change this a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to say cat, okay, backslash. So I'm going to take each of those files and I'm going to do a type. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want the MP4s that are there. And so now I'm doing that from one machine, and you're going to see that in the next couple seconds. Okay, now look at that. Now we've got FS read data 0.01%, but that's going to change in a minute. Okay, and look at that. MP4s, I've touched 60, 80, etc. So remember, it's only updating every 5 seconds, but we're going to see this. All these numbers are growing. There's the read data is changing in that regard. Let me come back here, and I'm going to grab this command, make it simple on myself, and come here and do the same thing. All right. So now you're going to see each of these increase again. Here you go. And you're going to see more of these MP4s, 356 in that 5-second period. And you're going to see the read data increasing a little bit as we go through it. So there's a lot that you can get. I'm going to show you one final thing, and then we're going to go on to Splunk. But here are the individual panels, and so you can create them any way that you want. So for instance, status codes. If I want to go look at this panel, I want to design it, see how it was done. Here's all of the filters and what I'm grabbing, et cetera, and so on. I could actually change the way it looks. So I could say, show it this way, save it, right? Then when I come back to the dashboard, okay, there's my panel down here that shows it a little bit different now. So each one of those panels, you create them in visualizations, you create a dashboard, you drag and drop the panels, you can lay them out any way you want, etc. So that's pretty much it in ElasticSearch. I'm going to get out of this. Bharat, if you want to get ready for your presentation there.
Thank you, Mike. Let me share my screen. You showed a fantastic demo with ElasticSearch, and we have similar configurations for Splunk. We can define dashboards, and additional to that, we can define alerts if we need. And it is basically have similar idea, but before I'm showing this, what we need to consider in our configuration. As you see in our definitions, we have fields in our CSV format. So we need to define our fields for Splunk, and we need to run any queries according to our field definitions that can help us to identify the things easier than to try to find some definitions. Okay, let me show my demo. Yeah, we have the same approach. We just need to define our Splunk system IP addresses on our cluster, and then we can easily see our audit logs. We just need to define a data input here for our cluster. As Mike mentioned, we only have TCP, so we need to define our Qumulo Audit Logs data inputs with TCP. Actually, it is very basic, and if you visit our website, you can see you just need to define a source type like this one to identify Qumulo audit logs rather than the other ones, and you just need to give the port number. If you use this port for any other purpose, you can select another port number, and you manually define this on Qumulo. And also another things, as I mentioned, fields. You can define your own fields here with field extraction capabilities. There are some other definitions, but our definition is here. As you see, you just need to use our example, and you don't need to do this manually, but Splunk also gives you define your own extraction if you wish. And if you define all these things, you can immediately see your audit logs on Splunk, and you can search and support them in a right way. For example, if you run any search, you can see in history. And basically, if we want to see Qumulo audit logs for the last 24 hours, you can see like this. And you can see the field definitions. We have client IP, node name, operation type, protocol, and so on. Definitions are here. And if you want to search any specific definition, for example, this is my client. I want to see only this client activities here. So you can add this definition to search bar and see immediate results here. Let me do this. Okay. Or you can also say, I want to see only IP client definition for this, and you can easily figure out which activities and that client ran in the past. And you can increase the field definitions to identify a specific operation, but also you can use this kind of queries for alerting or adding a panel for your dashboards. Let me show some alert example. For example, you can define high delete activity alerts, so you can count some numbers, and you can run alerts according to this. For example, you can say, okay, if I see this kind of activity more than 20, I want to receive this alerts. There are many options. You can push this as an event, or you can run another script to stop this activity. For example, if you want to drop the assembly session of that user, maybe you can run this one, or you can receive an email, or you can use a webhook for another application. For dashboards, again, we can define our own dashboards for Qumulo. At this point, we need to identify which queries that we want to see. We have this example similar to Mike's one. We can identify our operation types, and if we checked what kind of details that we run, actually it is very basic. We just count the operations, and we shape them with a pie chart. And if we want to do another thing, like, for example, if we want to identify database details, we can use another one. It's just to select which kind of panel that we want to see. And then we can put our query to see the required results, protocol distributions, node distributions, or top 10 clients distributions as well. Also, we can check the failed operations and their resources, because generally we can catch some unauthorized activities that can be important for us here. So if we see there are many file open activities, but they resulted with failures, and we can say, okay, this is there's an issue we need to consider, and we need to check the details. So we can turn back our search, and we can identify the operations again with using our definitions. For example, I have several SMB login. Not this one, sorry. For example, if I see several SMB login failure, I need to consider who is trying to do this, and which client it is. It is part of our authorized clients, or it is part of, for example, if you have a Wi-Fi connection, and if you if you don't have any rule on firewall to access SMB, maybe there's an issue with that. So you can also figure out there's something wrong in your environment, and you need to fix this issue. And if we check Splunk methodology for Qumulo, it is very basic to identify anything, but also you need to consider how you manage your licensing cost, because at the end of the day, it has a licensing cost. If you receive a lot of Qumulo activities, maybe you need to put you need to use our log filters to identify the required ones. Maybe you can combine different CM solutions together. As we mentioned, you can use Splunk for some critical audit logs, and you can define ElasticSearch for other operations. So you can use our log filter for this purpose. So you can define multiple destinations for your Qumulo audit logs. Maybe it can be a little bit tough to maintain this kind of things, but at the end of the day, you can have less licensing cost to run this environment. And that's it. This is end of my presentation.
So Barak, can you go back to the slide presentation? There's one more slide at the end there. We'll just do a wrap up.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so let's just wrap up a little bit. There we go. So this just brings back together the things we were talking about earlier. I just want to highlight them as a wrap up. So if you're interested in either getting started with ElasticSearch or Splunk, or maybe you've already got some other audit logging software, but if you're interested in ElasticSearch or Splunk, we have a prototype on GitHub. Again, here's the GitHub address, and you can download and then go to the video on YouTube, and it actually walks you through the entire installation on a Docker cluster or Docker swarm. Another one is go to the CARE site, and you can actually just do a search if you want on Splunk, and it will come up with this article, or you can actually take that link and just click it, and it'll go right to that article on the CARE site. So that's pretty much it. Billy and Mandy, if you want to open for questions, we're available.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, we've got a couple of private questions here. And then I'm also sharing some of the KB articles and documents here. One of the questions we received privately was around how much data does this expect to generate?
So I've been running my ElasticSearch with 7x24, gathering those 500 cameras out of a cluster. So as I said, it's going 7x24, 265 megabytes per second on average, and I've got about 40 gig worth of data. Now, both in ElasticSearch and Splunk, you set up prune parameters. So I've got mine so that it prunes at 30 days and drops everything out of the database. You can go for longer, but I would expect 30 days would be about 300 to 400 gig for those 500 cameras. If you have more activity, it could go up to a terabyte. If you have less activity, it's less than that.
Yeah, depends on your regulations. Maybe if you have a restrict regulations and you have to keep them longer, you need to have a larger storage.
Great.
Next question.
So if someone makes changes to quota, can I see that in audit logging?
Yes, absolutely. So you can actually see the admin event, if you will, for the quota. You won't necessarily see the data because, well, you would actually have to be looking in a search term, and you could build a panel where you'd say, I want to look at this directory path and do a prefix. So for instance, /home/mcade for mine. And then I could actually see how much data was in there and how much was added and deleted. So there's no limits on what you can do if you want. We have a customer, I won't say who it is, of course, but we have a customer who puts all their home directories in one path, /home, it's on the Qumulo and /home. And then they've got over 10,000 directories in there. So now you could do something along the order of creating a panel that looks at just the prefix of /home, and then you could actually count and do a database query on the ElasticSearch, Splunk, or probably some of these others where you say, give me the top 10 directories that are there. And then you'd see just based on the audit logs what the top 10 directories are. Now, understand, this is based on audit logging. This is not necessarily based upon the data that's in those clusters. So it's not going to be accurate in terms of, let me give you an example. Let's say that you create a cluster and it's got 100 terabytes of data on it as an example. And then you turn on audit logging. We're only going to grab the data from the time you turned on audit logging, not before. So we won't know that there's, say, 5 terabytes of data for every user that's in the directory. We only know what's been added or subtracted since you turned on audit logging. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. So if you want to know from the beginning, turn on audit logging in the beginning. Otherwise, you won't have an accurate representation. Next question, Billy.
So we've got one from Juan. He says, can you show again how to send the logs on Splunk?
Yeah. Actually, we can show our care article. Maybe it can be more useful. So if you visit care.qumulo.com and search Splunk, this is the article. It shows how you can add Qumulo source type. You just need to select settings, data, source types, and you can give whatever name you want. And you just need to say, I want to use TCP with this port, and you can define your definitions. Actually, the only thing you need to consider the port number and the source type name, and that's it. And for the field extraction, again, you can click settings, fields, and create new one. And you can copy this definition here and put this field and save it. after that, you just need to say, I want to send my audit logs to my Splunk machine with this port number. That's it. And after that, you can see Qumulo audit logs under your Qumulo audit log source. Right.
Hopefully that answered the question. If not, ask it or elaborate a little bit more, Juan. But until then, why don't we move on? Do you have another question there, Billy?
Yeah, so it's a two-parter here. We've got from an anonymous folk. Does enabling audit have a performance impact on the Qumulo? And then the second part is, can it stay on permanently?
There is certainly no reason that you can't leave it on permanently. I'll do part two as well. And in terms of performance, no, not really. And here's why. We're grabbing those audit logs and storing them anyway. That was built into the cluster, or was, I should say, it was added to the cluster probably 4 or 5 years ago, if I'm going back in time. I've been here 8 years, and I can't remember a time it wasn't there. But I think it was about 5 years ago or so that we added auditing. And when we added it, we decided to take into account the performance up front, because what we do is we grab those audit logs and we store them on the cluster itself. And when you turn on auditing and say, here's my syslog server, here's my Splunk server, then we dump all those logs off to that syslog server. So it isn't that we're, by enabling auditing, decreasing performance. It's actually, we're just shedding the logs over to another or to a target, if you will. We've been collecting them whether you enable them or not. And hopefully that answers your question. Next, Billy.
Perfect. Yeah. So if someone deletes snapshots, can I see this in audit logging?
Yes.
Yep.
Again, all the admin events are trapped in audit logging.
Okay. We have one more here. It says, what is the delay for change when using audit logging?
Delay for change. The only thing I can surmise from the question is that, let's say that, and I may be wrong, and elaborate a little bit more in the chat or whatever if you want more elaboration. But let's say that I go and create a file. How long does it take before I see that event in the audit log? And so that should be almost instantaneous. Of course, it's milliseconds behind, let's be honest, because it's got to go into our log, get shipped off the syslogger to Splunk, get ingested into ElasticSearch, and then as you see, I had a 15-second delay. So, but if I were to say display events every second, I would have seen that before I would have noticed anything, even though it probably took 10 to 15 milliseconds for all that process to occur.
And to kind of a little bit,
It's super fast.
yeah, it's really, really quick. So each node individually has some amount of memory set aside to buffer these messages in case the receiving syslog server is either offline momentarily or it has some kind of delay. So the nodes themselves can collect an amount of messages. I kind of forget, it's something like 100,000 messages each node or whatever. So even if there's a blip in communication or there's some delay on the receiving end, the messages won't necessarily get lost.
Yeah, and the other thing, by the way, folks, that was our knowledge expert emeritus there, Joe Costa, who you've probably heard in other webinars. But the other thing that you should note is that every audit log entry has a timestamp. So even as Joe says, if you get a blip where it doesn't go to syslog right away, or it shows up in ElasticSearch on a panel and it seems like it's 5 seconds before you see it on the panel, it's got the timestamp of when it really occurred down to the millisecond. Next, Billy.
All right. So with multiple Qumulo clusters, do we use log filter or Splunk to split the audit logs off the syslog?
No. So in my case, I've got 2 clusters going in, and the way it works is that when you set up your syslog server, and again, that's an article, that's a KB article on how to set up the syslog server. There's a syslog configuration file on a Linux server, and as I said, it's only a 1-pager. It's not burdensome. Any admin can sit down and do it in probably 10-15 minutes. But what we do is that as part of that article, you'll see that we create a /var/logs/Qumulo in the syslog server, and we drop the files by the node in there. So you would see in var log Qumulo, you'd see in my example, group-1, group-2, group-3, and they're all individual files by the node. I have it set up in syslog that every hour, those, or until it hits, I think it's 10 megabytes or something like that, every one of those just continually grows those files. So if I'm getting data, audit logs from node 1 of Groot, it'd be group-1, and it would be a file. And when 1 hour occurs, or I think I've got it as 10 megabytes, it renames that file to Groot-1 with a timestamp, and then it creates a new Groot-1. Now, when I import those into ElasticSearch, I'm using 2 processes. ElasticSearch has 2 processes that deal with looking at audit logs. One looks at files, and that's what I really want to do, is I want to look at the files in the syslog server, and it's called file beats. And what it does is it sees what are the new files in the var log Qumulo, and it takes those and it passes it on to Logstash, another process in the ElasticSearch system. And Logstash goes and does that whole thing where I was talking about taking a file path and splitting off the extension, so it can create additional fields off your data, and then that ships it off to ElasticSearch to say, store it in this field format. Splunk is a little bit more sophisticated in that Splunk can define the fields. Brat showed you, you take that regular expression, you drop it from our KB article in there, and it breaks the fields out. Now, if you want to break another field, like a file extension, like kind of like what I did, you would need to change that regular expression to grab a piece off of that path name, and it would create a whole nother field for you. In ElasticSearch, that's 2 processes. One that reads the syslog data, and one that goes and massages that syslog data before it sends it into ElasticSearch. That's pretty much it. That was a very long-winded way of answering your question, and I hope I did. Billy?
Yeah, it looks like that's all the questions I have. Let me do one more pass here. Yeah, I don't see any more in the open section. There's no on the private section. So yeah, I think that's all the questions that we have right now. Yeah, I don't see any other ones here. So.
All right. Well, then let's just wrap this up. We'll give you back 10 minutes of your day. I want to thank everyone, no matter what time zone you're in and what part of the world, for attending our latest webinar. As you know, and you've gotten notifications of these in the past, we like to do these on, I think they're monthly, aren't they, Billy?
You're right.
Yeah, every month we have a new type of knowledge that we'd love to pass on to you. Hopefully you'll see that we spend quite a bit of time working on these and passing the data off to you in a format that you can consume and use. And we thank you for attending today. Thank you very much to everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.